And the sound's good. Everything's good.
Yeah, doing good. So everyone, welcome. I'm here with my friend Darrell Epp, and this is fun because I've known Darrell for a while now. Darrell and I have even done a couple of things in the past. We did a little podcast together that you may or may not have seen called Imaginary Lines. It's on YouTube. Go check it out if you're curious. But the reason why we were coming together now was to talk about Darrell's brand new book. And Darrell's first book with Quoir Publishing, first book published by an American publisher, because if you didn't know, Darrell's from Canada, and his previous books were published in Canada. And so super excited now to have his first US publication. It's called Permanent Smoke, and releasing October 4th. By the time you're watching this, hopefully that's today. And so yeah, please go out and pick that up on Kindle and in paperback. And just wanted to take some time with Darrell and talk about a little bit about Darrell and a little bit about this book, and maybe even get him to read some poetry and give us some background and stuff like that. So Darrell, welcome.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm grateful to know you. So yeah, full speed ahead.
Yeah, all right. All right, so your new book is called Permanent Smoke. Now you said, so is this your fifth book?
Yeah, it's the fifth book, and it's called Permanent Smoke for a reason. And the reason is I live at the western tip of Lake Ontario in an industrial town. Let me say that one time John Waters came here and he said he liked my neighborhood because it reminded him of Baltimore.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's that kind of place.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's very much like a Pittsburgh,
yeah,
Erie, Pennsylvania kind of place. And down the street here, we have Dominion Foundry and Castings Company, DeFasco, where it used to employ 18,000 people, and now it employs 3,000 people and makes more steel,
wow.
thanks to robot arms.
Yeah, there you go. Progress.
So it's sort of what happened to Bethlehem Steel in Syracuse, New York. The story's been repeated all over these places. Right. So Hamilton was always sort of a byword for air pollution, blue collar people. And then it's like, what do you do when a generation of men don't have work?
Yeah.
And then it was also called Permanent Smoke because smoke isn't permanent, it's ephemeral, which right. is also like the memories that we use to construct our worldview out of. So I wanted to talk about these changes that are going on at the western tip of Lake Ontario that are being echoed across the hemisphere, but not in a direct way, just sort of hit it sort of obliquely through the rarefied language of poetry, so it has a better chance of sticking.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, I love that.
And along the way, talk about things that are universal, right? Like when the steel mill here fired me, that sucked for me, but there's a way to talk about that specifically in a way that is universal, because we all have dreams that didn't come true, desires that were frustrated, things that really keep us up at night. We are all subject to the passage of to the ravages of time. So I'm all in on this project. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the beautiful thing about poetry is you can talk about the specific, but at the same time, there's layers to that. And so, if you do it well and you do it well, there can be sort of these emotional layers that kind of unfold as you read it. There's more than just what's on the surface. And I really appreciate that about your poetry. And I really especially appreciate it when you get to read your poetry. Because I think for anybody who picks up Permanent Smoke, they will benefit from having heard you read at least one or two of your poems, because then they can get your voice in their head. It's kind of like, once you've ever seen Star Wars, if you read a book about Star Wars and Darth Vader says anything, it'll always be in the voice of James Earl Jones. So it's kind of like that. Like once they hear you read some of your poems, then it's like from now on, when they read them themselves, they'll hear your voice.
Yeah, okay. I believe that's my segue.
If you want, yes. Why don't you read us something?
Okay, so here's a poem. I think it's in the new book, or it might be in the one after that. Keith doesn't know it, but on October 4th, 2023, this poem will be in a book he's publishing called Alien Phonics Primer.
Oh, this is a sneak peek.
Yeah, and it's called Like a Ninja. Some days come with complimentary gift wrapping. Today is not one of those days. Was that last luxury space flight just a new way of kicking sand in my face now that we're running low on sand? You could dress up like a ninja, wake up the neighbors by bashing two clouds together, and you'd still be part of the same dirty engine. The Forever War makes it hard to plan, even turns the grocery list into gibberish. Autocorrect sabotaged the wedding proposal. One bit of unruly code, and I was asking for extra ketchup on the hamster. There's big doors that you can't open on your own, and former model citizens sleeping in their cars. The unlucky average, caught in the bell curve's undertow, were promised retraining, bread, circuses. The admiral's daughter played it safe, wrote a book about courage, hit the morning talk show circuit. They said the market was in a bubble. Even worse, the priest wore Bermuda shorts and a Guns N' Roses t-shirt under his cassock. That's when all the magic tiptoed out the back door, and I started sleeping in on Sundays.
Oh, wow. Oh,
So that's a poem.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. There's so many great little images in there. I love the, was it the general's daughter played it safe and wrote a book on courage?
Yeah. And it's funny because I'm not the first person to point this out. That honor goes to Black Sabbath and the song War Pigs, where wars are fought by the people with the least to gain from winning them.
That's right.
Right. But oh well. And also, I just noticed no one ever votes for war, but they always get it. Right.
Right.
But somehow your vote matters.
Of course. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
But not in things that really matter like that.
Yeah. So it's an interesting problem about when you're like, I guess most people want to be good at their jobs. And so I thought I want to. So the first time I had a book out, I'm like, oh, wow, my dream came true. What do I do now? Right. And then I thought, well, let's keep going. And then I thought, why don't I keep on raising the bar? Right. And like, I thought I published a book of poetry. Gerard Manley Hopkins, who in my opinion is the best ever, Isaiah, Homer. Now I'm part of this guild. So now I want to try to be worthy of membership.
Yeah.
So what if I kept on trying to push it? And the thing is, like the admiral's daughter, she's going to have an easy life and all this stuff. And thinking, wow, that's remarkable in the sense I should make a remark, right? And for some reason, once I see all this stuff that bugs me, as soon as I start sculpting it and shaving it into lines, I like how Franz Kafka said, your life has meaning because it ends. And if you were immortal and just went on and on and on, there'd be no music, no structure. That'd be horrible, right? And your life has meaning because it ends. And endings are interesting to me. If you're a novelist, you get to write one ending every 3 years. but when you're a poet, you can do it once a week, right? So
I love that.
yeah, so poems have beginnings and endings, and they're built out of lines which have beginnings and endings.
Hmm.
And you know how Shakespeare has that iambic pentameter in every line, which makes it so hard, which makes Shakespeare so easy to memorize.
Right.
Um, and you know, like the King James Bible, the first time you hear "Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief," because of the meter, you can never forget it, right?
That's right.
So as soon as I take, if I just start, you know, if I just make a list of things that bug me, I might just be like the crackpot on the back of the bus talking to himself. But as soon as I start sculpting it into lines,
Right.
suddenly this sort of authority or elegance hopefully pops up, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so true. And when you, so speaking of that, when, and maybe it's different for each poem, but do you find yourself sort of when you're on the bus or going through your life or whatever, oh, I got an idea for a line. So is it just like a single line, you write it down in a little notepad and you leave it there, and then sometime later you assemble a whole bunch of different ones that kind of seem to string together, and then you sort of assemble a poem? Or does it often come about that you start to write the line and you continue to the end and you write one whole poem at once? Or does it vary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe W.H. Auden, who was a great poet, he said a poem is never finished; it is only ever abandoned.
Yes.
Which means you can certainly drive yourself insane, second guessing everything you do in the poem and never get to page two and just
Yeah.
wind up in the nut house.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and every poem does have its own. To answer your question, the first thing I will say to the listener is if you want to do something in life, start now because
Yeah.
everything gets harder when you're older. See, now I'm old and broken down and all this stuff. I remember when I was like in my 20s, I'd be literally on the bus and I could just think of plots while I was riding the bus
Yeah.
because you have so much energy and you'll never be young again. There are all these things that bother you.
Yeah.
Every relationship has to be Romeo and Juliet, where, oh, she dumped me, I've got to kill myself. When, like,
Right.
if you wait 6 months, you wouldn't even remember her name, right? Like, relax, right? So start now. Like, just get to work, right? Just start writing now. Don't worry about it. Just go.
Yeah.
And uh, when I was young, everything's easier when you're young. And now, um, I've had people say to me that they read my stuff and they think that because my poetry, I believe, has joy in it, they think it's easy. And it's not exactly easy sometimes, your fella. Um, Now I do different things. Uh, One thing I've found in the past couple of years that was really helpful was I would keep a notebook, which I didn't do before, where because I'm a surrealist, I really had to. Part of being a surrealist writer is putting your faith in the spontaneity of the process to guide you through.
Yeah.
Where just say, here's a blank piece of paper, I'm going to fill it with 24 lines, go. And part of the joy was seeing if you could pull it off, right?
Yeah.
And uh, I've found so much value out of doing that. But now sometimes I'll have a day where I'm like, let's just go to the park and record sense data
Yes.
and then maybe save that for a rainy day or do
Yeah.
different things, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll get stuck halfway through and think, man, I don't want to blow this because this is good so far. And I'll go through an old notebook um, and see a note I wrote to myself in the past, say, hey, Darrell, you know, this is hello, future Darrell. This is past Darrell. When you're in a jam, try this, right? And get some
Right.
duct tape and tie it together, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it seems like mostly the process, like assuming you've done your homework and you spent 30 years loitering at the public library, absorbing, you know, the grades and all this stuff and knowing the craft side of things. the joyfulness of the process sort of keeps things motoring towards the finish line.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very cool. I think for a lot of people, if there are people watching that are familiar with Quoir publishing, typically Quoir in the past, although Quoir has published fiction, for the most part, mostly publishes nonfiction, theological kind of like books on different doctrines or teachings or things like that. And so the decision to publish our first poetry book with you, for a lot of people might seem strange, like what we publishing a poetry book for? And so I want you to talk a little bit about poetry and why you think it's important and relevant for today. But I just want to say before that, the reason why I wanted to publish poetry, number one, but first of all, that you would be our first poetry book. Because I feel like there is something, poetry is something that typically most people don't read it. I know a lot of people don't go out and go, hey, I'm going to go buy this new poetry book, my favorite hot poet that just came out, right? Then it's not the way they follow a musician or a favorite film director or a novelist or something like that. So it may seem strange, like poetry. What is this? But poetry, if people haven't exposed themselves to the kind of poetry that you write, I'm hoping this will be the first opportunity for them to experience it, because the kind of poetry you're writing, it has a social component, like a social commentary. It's speaking about not just the world we're in at the moment, but the human experience in that moment, and doing it in a very creative, unexpected way that I think might help people think about things in ways they wouldn't normally think about. One of my favorite quotes, I used to keep this I've had this in my wallet since I was like in junior high, I think. No, I'm sorry, high school, because it was in high school that I came across it. Lord Byron, who was also a poet, it was a statement that he had made where he said, and well, I guess it's sort of a poem, but he says something like, a word is a thought, and a small drop of ink on a page can help millions, perhaps thousands, to think. And that quote just, that's why I wrote it down, put it on a piece of paper, stuck it in my wallet, because that's to me the essence of what writing is. Being able to write in such a way that when someone reads it, it makes them think. Ultimately, I think that's all we want to do. We want people to get to a place where they stop and think about whatever it is, God, theology, the world they're living in, the way they love or treat their neighbors, whatever, right? And so that's what I love and appreciate in your poetry. I see that. I see that essence, that spirit in your poetry as well. I love that. But for those, but I'm curious what you would say about like why poetry and why now and why this book, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, personally, in my life, I've worked in the theater, writing screenplays, training actors, done journalism, short fiction. When I went to poetry, things clicked for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's a big secret to say that the times we're living through right now are strange. Things are changing much more rapidly than they did for your grandparents, things like that. So assuming you don't want to be a hack writer, assuming you do think that art is crucial, not just decoration or an afterthought. The question is, how do you express something that is true in a way that's effective? And I just thought, like Homer and Isaiah have lasted 3,000 years. Will my clever tweets fare as well as they have, right? That seems doubtful. And it's funny, if I'm left alone, I would prefer to read Henry James novels where he could spend 7 pages describing how a lady folds her napkin.
Yeah.
Right. But I have to admit, if you want to communicate in 2022, a Victorian novel of manners probably isn't the way to go, right?
Probably not.
So once I started writing poetry, I was interested in the technical possibilities, the way every page, has a surprise.
Yeah.
I just thought this is wild, and it makes every novel at that rack at Walmart just seem like overpuffed junk.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, yeah, I get it. The good guy wins on page 360. I don't. Why do I have
Yeah.
But the poetry I was reading, I really did have moments like I would love to make someone feel the way this poet made me feel.
Right.
Hopkins or whoever. And then once I dug a bit deeper, um, I thought that poetry is not old fashioned. What if it's actually futuristic and state of the art and the best way to talk about this time? And I think poetry has a really interesting way of dealing with time, the passage of time. And what I'm doing in my last couple of books, I believe poetry is the best way to simulate states of consciousness.
Mm.
Like, how movies are very literal, right? Like they go forward in time. And when Brad Pitt says the Cowboys are over there, it takes you as long to watch him say that as it takes him to say that.
Right.
So the ratio of narrated time to time of narration is 1 to 1. It's the most literal form, right? Um,
Yeah.
and poetry allows you to dilate time in a way that is really interesting. And I just thought, do you notice? Let's say I said, do you write a book about your day? How much of that book would be describing latitude and longitude coordinates? And how much of those interesting parts of your day took place between your ears?
Right.
And do you ever notice when you're walking to buy milk, you can think about a fictional character as easily as you can about a real person, or daydream about the future as easily as you can about the past.
Yeah.
Isn't that remarkable? Let's remark on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Also, poetry has a lot in common with comics. Check out this. Picture a panel, picture a square, and in the first panel is you, like a headshot like this, and you're clean shaven, okay? And the next to it is an identical panel, except now you have a beard, okay? Literally faster than the front part of your brain can retrieve the words for it.
Yeah.
The back part of your brain says, oh, okay, this is 4 weeks later,
Right.
right? And that magic happened between the panels.
Right. Like that. Yeah. Instantly.
So it's like if you read Gerard Manley Hopkins, um, you're like, okay, here's 14 lines, 50 words. I should be able to handle this. And then you're reading it and you're like, oh, we were at 30,000 feet and now we're at ground level. Okay. And now, try to keep up, right?
Yeah.
And that just seems to be a more accurate simulation of what consciousness is like and like what a moment is like. So I just think there's plenty of I would encourage anyone to write a poem today.
Yeah. 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 I think what's so funny is like you said, I think people assume that that, well, you wrote a poem, and it's like this long. Oh, that must have taken you 2 minutes. Like it took as long for you to write it as it took me to read it, right? Like, oh, that was easy.
Yeah. That'd be
But
awesome.
it's like the joke, right, about how I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time.
Yeah.
Right, because it takes more energy and more time to take all these ideas, sort of like take the giant slab of granite and whittle it away down to something that's really simple and beautiful and does everything you want it to do in this little space, right? So yeah, it's not as if it takes more skill to write a 300-page novel than it does to write a couple of poems that are this big. It may even take more energy because you're trying to communicate so much information and so much truth and beauty and feeling and emotion in a handful of lines, right?
Well, also, I guess as you you've written many books, and as time goes by, you sort of think to yourself, why am I doing this, right?
Right.
Like, did you write your last book to sell as well as Harry Potter, right? What was the reason for it? And
Right.
then it's funny because, you kind of bump into these questions that are transcendental, where like you wake up one morning and you're writing your book and you're like, why am I doing this? Why don't I just watch the Rockford Files and take it easy? But then everyone asks, why? Why am I doing this?
Right.
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 And as your skills as a writer develop, um, if you don't sell as well as Harry Potter and become a billionaire, for me the big consolation prize is the surprise of going, oh wow, I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
It's cool that you're kind of like discovering new territory,
Yeah.
and that's always fresh with every blank page. Um, and hopefully, as you can keep on writing, you can keep on finding moments that are true and universal. Um, and yeah, about poetry, um, I it sounds like a religious project if I say this, but I with my 5 books, if you read them all together, I am trying to slow down time to build a time machine. And it's pretty obvious in our moment, we're obsessed with speed, where we say 30 minutes or it's free. And if I don't get what I want when I want it, I get very angry.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And um, in a poem, you can dilate time in the sense that here's a poem, you could, in theory, read it in 30 seconds. But to really read it, you would have to reread it and maybe read it again tomorrow and maybe give it some thought.
Hmm.
So now the time starts to dilate because let's say, here's a poem about me waiting for a bus, right? Then the bus comes, right? So it's a minute out of my life. Now you're spending more than a minute out of your life thinking about that moment, right? So the ratio keeps on changing on this one side. And then that sends a message to the reader if they read all these books kind of under the radar and the message is, hey, wait a minute. Um, Pay attention, right? It's like if you go to a church, the priest, he says, be attentive. And that's what happens when you go to church. They wave that stuff and they say, be attentive, right?
Right.
And you need that reminder, right? And if you don't be attentive, they say nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Right. Right.
Your mental real estate will be colonized by Hollywood, by Disney, by economic factors all the time, right? So by dilating time in the poetry, you actually send a message to the reader that says, hey, wait a minute, the all these bits of sense data that make up the ligaments of my day are worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
And what if I was more present when a bee was in front of me or I saw like a blossom, right?
Yeah.
What if I chose to be less agitated by this news and I just really noticed this leaf, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully, if people read poetry and my poetry or Hopkins or whoever, it will make them pay more attention to their surroundings in general,
Yeah. That's
which
great.
will have all sorts of good benefits.
Yeah.
Because
Exactly.
if they don't, economic drivers by default will be in the driver's seat every time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's like that. It sort of forces us to, or I don't say force, but it allows us an opportunity um, to actually be, like you said, be attentive rather than just listen to someone tell me to be attentive. Um, but by reading poetry and experiencing poetry, I am being attentive to do that, and then that sort of trains me and teaches me and gives me the experience of this is what it's like to be attentive. This is what it's like to pay attention, to be alive in this moment, and not rushing to the next one. I like that. So, do you have another poem you could read for us?
Sure. Um,
Do you have one from
this is,
from the book?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And just, this is the poem that I mentioned where when it's over, I actually have something to say about it,
Okay. Yep. Okay.
where normally when like people say, uh, normally I read a poem and someone says, "Oh, that was great. How'd you write it?" And I'm like, I wrote that in 2020. I have no memory. My memory's
Right.
shot. What are you talking about?
Right.
But, so this is a poem called uh, Post-Operative Poem with Half Its Stomach Removed. Why give me the keys if you didn't want me driving the getaway car? Meanwhile, bats can hear shapes and honeybees trade maps by dancing. So much beauty, it's absurd, swamping even my rage in its foamy riptide, its glamorous undertow. Got born again, then wound up with the same old me in the same old steel toes. That pair of boots, that one string of continuity holding my story together. The basement apartment filled with debris. I could just never shovel fast enough. Emptied my pockets for the bored cops outside the all-night pharmacy. Ditto the Walmarts where my rowboat ran aground when the surf rolled out. The stylish dance of every blade of grass when the wind picks up. Unique as fingerprints, I lose track. Start over from the beginning. Underfoot, the insect kingdom giggles, bursting with secrets. Canada geese plangently reply to the Humvee's furious car alarm. Frantic stickman commuters like Scrooge McDuck's wind-up toys. Me, I refuse to fill out my employee performance review form. Formlessness is my specialty, I explain. It reminds me of snoozing in the womb before the Big Bang, the first kiss, and the gastroenterology waiting room. These magazines are 7 years old, I said. But what I meant was, I'm sorry, and I know it's too late. When he squeezed my finger, I was a kid again. Liar, liar, pants on fire. At least they gave him a window. Slanted sheets of snow blanketed the vineyard. I mean, where the vineyard used to be.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a poem. And now I'll tell you a funny story. Um, uh, there was a time about a year ago, I was lying in bed and I thought to myself, well, I've said it all. There's nothing left to say. There's nothing left in the world to write about. I've said it all. It's over, right? I got nothing to say, nothing to write about.
Right.
I'm done. And then I thought, oh, wow, here's season 3 of the Rockford Files. I'll give that a whirl.
Yeah.
And then I said, I like the sensation of scribbling. Let's just start scribbling, right? So I just went out to a park and just started scribbling and then came up with this poem.
Hmm.
And then when it was over and I was um, uh, checking it over, I read it and I thought, oh, yeah, it's actually true. My dad just had an operation last week where they took out a third of his stomach. And because of COVID, I was the one person allowed in there. And anesthesia hits you a lot harder when you're older. So it was
Yeah.
a really rough time, right? So the way I write, I would never sit down and think I'm going to write about
About that.
something,
Yeah.
right? I would never do that. And whenever I'm writing, I always picture my poems taking place in 1997, um, back when I was young and full of energy and people didn't have cell phones and I could understand the world, right?
Yes, those are the days.
Yeah. So it was just funny about I had this big event and I'm sitting there thinking, well, I got nothing to write about. The well's gone dry, right? And so that was something funny that happened. And it turns out the same thing happened to Joseph Conrad. And Joseph Conrad had a huge burst of productivity that straddled the turn of the century. So on the one hand, you can say he's the last of the great Victorian novelists and also the first of the great modernist novelists. And in the space of like 5 years, he wrote Typhoon, Youth, Lord Jim, Heart of Darkness, An Outcast of the Islands, a really astonishing run,
Wow.
just amazing. And he had this perverse desire, Joseph Conrad, to do everything the hard way. Like imagine if you said to yourself, you wanted to be a giant of world literature, and you choose to do it in the fourth language you ever learned.
Yeah.
That's pretty messed up, right? So he always, until then, would need like raw material from his own crazy life to get started. And he said, I used up all of my personal stories and I'm stuck, right? So then in 1903, he spent most of that year in a catatonic stupor, just kind of like staggering around like a zombie. Very strange. And then he was in a used bookstore and he came across a book that reminded him of a story he'd heard in a bar 20 years earlier about a guy in South America who stole a barge full of silver. And when he saw that and the memory came back, it actually jolted him and knocked him off his feet like electricity. And
Wow.
he had these visions of silver bars in his head and about how he could use silver as a symbol the way he had used like the Congo River previously.
Hmm.
And then he went home and then wrote a novel called Nostromo. And F. Scott Fitzgerald said that, with the possible exception of Madame Bovary, Nostromo was the greatest novel in the history of the English language.
Wow.
Yeah. And then after Nostromo, he had another like 17 years of writing and just being at it, right? After being hit by that shock, right?
Wow.
So my point is, if this is ever viewed by a creative person who thinks they're stuck or they're having a hard time, or if it's ever viewed by a person who's in a tough spot, I'm telling you, like, hang in there.
Hmm.
And any book or movie you see, it was made by a person who had the same hardships you do.
Right.
And um, they all go through these things, right? And like Rembrandt went bankrupt and Goya went deaf, and they're all human beings. Um, and if you think, the well's gone dry, like it happened to Conrad, and then look what happened the next year, right? So just hang in there.
Yeah. 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 I think in some ways, the coming to the edge of that moment of feeling as if I've said it all, I've done it all, there's nothing left to say, can be actually your greatest moment. Like you're on the precipice of maybe your greatest burst of creativity, your greatest idea, um, the thing that you didn't think you ever could do. Because I had a similar experience once too. Um, I wrote about it in my most recent book, actually, where although mine was a little different in the sense of like I was driving in my car and I was talking to God, and I literally said, I can't believe I said this, but I literally said to God, I know everything. There's nothing more to learn. I was so sad that there was really nothing more to learn. I knew the Bible. I understood all the scriptures. I understood everything about theology. And it was really sad because at this point I will never learn anything new again. And and I thought I was being sincere. I thought, yep, this is it. I've got nothing. And boy, was I wrong about that. In fact, for the next couple of years after that moment, I went through stuff where I was like, oh yes, I have so much to learn, and I really didn't know anything. But sometimes you have to reach that point. Maybe in some ways it's coming to the edge of like that youthful stupidity or that youthful. Because when you're young, I think you think, right, that you do. You have sort of this boundless, sort of endless well of creativity and energy and everything. But then when you kind of come up against it and you realize, oh, that was short, that was quick. I thought it was going to keep going, and now I feel like I'm at the end of it. That's really when your education and your opportunity in some ways can really begin.
Yeah. Also, one thing I would say to people is that uh, if you want to be happy and successful, uh, don't set goals. Goals always let you down.
Right,
Um, and instead of thinking in goals, think in terms of systems, where if you say, my goal is to get the gold medal, it sounds specific, but it's actually not.
right.
It's actually vague because it's off in the future,
Hmm.
right? And if you don't get the gold medal, you feel like a loser, right?
Right.
But if instead of thinking in terms of goals, think in terms of systems. So don't say, I'm going to get the gold medal. But if you say to yourself, I am the kind of person who goes to the gym every day, no matter what,
There you go.
okay? Even if it's only for 10 minutes, I'm the person who does that,
Yes.
okay? That makes sense. Okay. And also another thing that's really important is if you want to have a happy life as a creative person or just in general, don't think in terms of success or failure. Um, Whatever happens, just think of it as a step in a process.
Yeah.
Okay. Because George Harrison once said that he didn't really enjoy being a Beatle, but he said that any experience can be valuable if you allow yourself to learn something from it.
Right.
Okay. So I've done things that didn't work out, but it wasn't a failure because I said, oh, next time I have a book out, I won't try that method of promo. I'll try something else. And then
Yeah.
I'm still alive, still, still going forward. Right.
Right. Right.
So, so like, uh, don't harm yourself by thinking in terms of like, oh, did I win the Oscar or not? Just view it all as a step in a process.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
And
I like the way of framing it of like I'm the kind of person who does this consistent thing, or uh, I think that's much better than I'm the person who won this or who accomplished that, or yeah, because then it ties your value and your worth and your identity to that very specific thing, which may or may not happen. But you're not a failure if that doesn't happen. You're still way ahead of most people in that if you even woke up and wrote a poem every day, or you woke up and you wrote a chapter every day, you're already doing more than most people are doing.
yeah, also you have enough pressure surrounding you to be a big shot. And like, if you're not a big shot, you should just kill yourself because of the shame of it, right? We
Right.
don't need any help in that regard, right?
Right.
And and also, it's actually a really reductive way of looking at it. Like, like Rembrandt van Rijn, um, uh, he never traveled farther than 40 kilometers from the house he was born in.
Right.
Okay, not okay. Like he wasn't a high flying, guy in private planes like Ric Flair, right? And you know how Henry Nouwen wrote that book where that painting is in. He made a painting called "The Return of the Prodigal Son,"
Yes.
and then Henry Nouwen went to Russia to stare at this painting for 3 days, and then wrote a book about it,
Yeah.
right? And it's the best painting ever. It's awesome. You know
Yes.
that when Rembrandt van Rijn was painting that, while he was painting that, the repo man was literally taking his furniture away.
Wow.
Okay, that's
Wow.
not even an exaggeration.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's like if you ask his neighbors, and if you ask the repo man, and you ask the bank, Rembrandt was a big loser,
Right. And that's so true. I
right?
think you can find so many examples of that kind of a thing. I mean, Van Gogh is a famous one as well. If you watch any of the films or read anything about Van Gogh's life, I mean, by all accounts, during his lifetime, anybody who knew him would have said he was a failure. I think only his brother believed in him and saw his talent and was back. If his brother hadn't bought pretty much every painting he ever did and held on to it, we wouldn't probably even have any of the paintings that Van Gogh did. So in his mind, he may have died a failure, or at least in the mind of others, he may have died a failure. But of course, now people look at him like, oh, he was one of the greatest painters who ever lived. And you can say the same thing, just to pull in like something theological. You can say the same thing about Paul the Apostle, right? The Apostle Paul, started a couple of little churches here and there, but if you looked at them, they were a mess. Wrote a couple of letters, I mean, during his lifetime, they were just letters. Yeah, wrote one to the Galatians, wrote one to the Corinthians, wrote one to the Romans. Yeah, and then he's in jail. almost immediately he gets arrested, he's thrown in jail, and he died in jail. I mean, how is that success? How is that like, wow, way to go, man, life well lived? But you know what I mean? Like looking back, you could say, no, he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He did something that had more impact and more influence on millions, billions of people that you wouldn't expect. So I think it's wise and helpful to move away from that expectation that you have to be doing something like that to be doing something worthwhile. I think it's more about just being true to, again, going back to this thing about being true to who you are in this moment and doing what you know you need to be doing and what gives you your life that meaning, and do it and do it well.
Also, what you said about Paul in prison is pretty interesting if you think about it, because on the one hand, your self-preservation instinct is in the driver's seat most of the time. Otherwise, you wouldn't procreate and all that stuff. So nobody wants to go to prison.
Right.
Because prison sucks.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you look at art, whether it's Gerard Manley Hopkins or Rembrandt, it's like being punched in the face by Mike Tyson with an alien economy. Because here's Hopkins saying, yeah, I'm dead, I lived in poverty, but I'm presenting you with something that is transcendental and will always be true and will always be necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you actually made a list of the great books that are immortal that were written by prisoners.
Yeah.
Right. Like, John Milton, Paradise Lost, the best poem ever, Letters from a Birmingham Jail.
Right. Yeah. Or I was thinking we and I were watching the documentary about the Holocaust that Ken Burns just did, and the Diary of Anne Frank. I mean, here's this little girl just writing a diary. She doesn't think she's even writing anything anyone's ever going to read, and ends up writing something that is so beautiful and so powerful. She died never knowing that was ever going to have any impact on anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I haven't thought about Paul, that apostle, for a while, but it's always, what is interesting about the thing about prison is, I always say this, how Paul said, how like, to develop a skill like playing piano, you have to practice, like scales training, right? So Paul said, I have trained myself to be content in all circumstances.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, what would happen to our economy if that idea actually caught on, right? Like there'd be layoffs, right? Because our whole economy is based on selling people things they don't need, selling people things that are unhealthy, sugar, color.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's kind of funny when you are hit in the face by art and the kind of art I'm trying to make, you are reminded that there is a battle going on. And there's always a battle going on between these two different economies, and which will have supremacy in your life, right?
Yeah.
Like, Gerard Manley Hopkins was very poor, and he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't, as rich as Donald Trump or something. So he was a loser, right? And he had ill health and all this stuff. But the funny thing is, that's all a wash, because spoiler alert, we're all dying, right?
Yep.
We're all falling apart, right? So that's, so it's like when the state comes along to Paul and says, oh, wow, you are trying to tell people to be content no matter what, we'll put you in prison. Right. Paul's like, okay, so what? Did you just listen to what I said,
Yeah.
So again, you have art to remind yourself about things that don't change.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, humans are attracted to shiny things, like, limousines, private planes, whatever, right? But, there are moments in life when you feel something tugging at you, when you can't deny that, you you have these hungers, right? And the rate of technological change has to be mentioned because it's accelerating. You know, like if you had a time machine and talked to a Giles from 1521 to 1721, in those 200 years, there wouldn't be a lot of change,
Right.
right? You know, for 400 years in England, the price of a loaf of bread didn't change.
Right.
You know, they didn't have inflation. They had a very different economy. From the time
Yeah.
of Shakespeare to Dickens, the price of a loaf of bread was the same,
Right.
right? Now things are changing very quickly. So that seduces us to think that we have changed, okay? But what if
Right.
we don't, right? Okay, for the past 2.5 million years, there has never been a moment when bipeds choose to get less sunlight than this moment.
Right.
The sun is shining outside and we say, no, I'll stay inside and take the artificial alternative,
Right.
right? And because we've invented Velcro, we think we don't still need vitamin D from sunlight,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
weird. That's remarkable. Let's remark on it. Also, because we have Velcro, um, we we like to distract ourselves from these transcendental questions about you can work overtime and you're still going to die.
Right.
What is my response to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and hopefully sometimes if you're a kind of writer, you know, like when people like, you know, the Ramones, people who like the Ramones like them because someone would say, oh, every song sounds the same. And the person's like, yeah, that's why I like it. Right.
Right.
Right. And then, you know, David Bowie would alienate people by doing a glam record, then a soul record, then a Brian Eno record and all this stuff because he
Yeah.
had this
Like a blues.
curiosity,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's like, if you're Twisted Sister and you have a big hit, right, with that, like, we're not going to take it, you can't say, okay, I want to do a country record because suddenly I'm interested.
Although I
Right?
wish they would. That would have been hilarious. But
See, but the funny thing is, in life, being able to be curious and change your mind
yeah.
and try something new is the fun.
Right.
But if you're a one-hit wonder like Twisted Sister, you're stuck. You
Right.
can't say, okay, Twisted Sister is now a jazz fusion band and expect your loyal fan base to stick
Right.
with you,
Exactly.
right? Um, so when you're a writer, if you have a bit of success, you have this huge temptation to
Yeah.
repeat
Just
it,
keep going to the same well
right?
until it runs dry. Yeah.
Right? Like imagine you write a book and it gets published. That's crazy. And
Yeah.
imagine someone compliments you on this book. It's like, okay, I'd better do a sequel,
Yes.
right? And that's what a lot of people do, right? But there are some people who are, and like Rembrandt, like he wasn't an idiot. He knew what he could have done things differently. And as his paintings got better by our standards, his sales got worse and worse
Right.
because he was a modern before on the dawn of modernity.
Right.
So the audience wasn't there for it. We're his audience. So
Yeah.
he's like, what am I going to do? Do a disco album? I'm Rembrandt. I got to be me, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So if you're a writer, you have this choice sometimes where you're like, do I do like the sequel, right? Um, or do I try to do something different? And you know, if you say you wrote a book because you want to awaken people to the transcendental, people will call you a megalomaniac,
Right.
right? But so what, right? It's like, uh, you know, this is part of the fun. It's like, and the old cliche about the more specific you get, the more universal you get. Like my book is all about Hamilton, Ontario, right? Nobody knows where that is, I guess, but but it doesn't matter. It's because when you read Anton Chekhov, and you read a story about a cobbler in Siberia, you start to cry, not because you are a cobbler, but because you also have a dream that didn't come true, and you feel yourself inexorably drifting forward on the river of time.
Right. Right.
So it's just so exciting. Like, when you meet a stranger, you have small talk. You say, how about the weather? How about the local sports team? But if instead you encounter a stranger through art, you don't have to go small talk. You can immediately go to the most important things in their life.
Right. Right. That's
Right.
exactly right. Yeah.
And that's like a thrill like none other,
Yeah. Well, Darrell, I am so excited about this new book coming out. I know it's your fifth, but for a lot of us, it's your first. And I hope it's the first one that they discover you and find out just really how phenomenal, how fascinating these poems are, and that they spend a good long time reading them and reading them again and thinking about them and being attentive and being in the moment. And hopefully then when they leave their house and go outside their doors, they start noticing things too. So I'm very grateful for you, your friendship, grateful for this book, excited that you're already working on the next one. That's awesome.
Well, I've kind of painted myself into this corner where now I just have to paint my way back out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
But yeah, I'm also very grateful, and I hope if someone reads my book, it inspires them to write their own book, and that will only result in them seeing benefits from it, whatever they may turn out to be. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, Darrell. Everybody go check out Permanent Smoke. It's on Kindle and on paperback on Amazon and wherever you buy your books online, you'll find it. And yeah, thanks so much, Darrell.
Okay, thank you. Great.